predictability of our proceedings to those visiting, I point out that we're about to have a point of order, not just any old point of order, but a point of order from the mother of the House, the female member with the longest uninterrupted service since, I think, October the 28th, 1982, if my research is correct or my recollection is accurate. Point of order, Harriet Harman.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for agreeing to hear this point of order. The House will obviously be fully aware that we have a very important vote tomorrow in which all honourable members will want to take part. And I raise the issue of my honourable friend, the member for Hampstead and Kilburn, who is 9 months pregnant and due to have a caesarean tomorrow. Now, she should not have to choose between going through the division lobby in a wheelchair, 9 months pregnant, having postponed her caesarean, or losing her right to vote. If the whips were to agree, and with the agreement of the Leader of the House, would it be possible, Mr. Speaker, for you to facilitate her to have a proxy vote so she can have her baby and have her vote? This is something the House agreed to in February last year in principle. In the circumstances of this important vote tomorrow and my honourable friend's pregnancy, would it be possible for this to be arranged?
Well, I will come to the honourable lady happily, but perhaps... very well. Let's hear it now. Point of order, Emma Reynolds.
Further to that point of order, Mr. Speaker, could you advise me as to how to expedite the process of introducing proxy votes? And I would wonder, how many babies do we collectively have to have in this House before we see any change? I will be probably on my second before we have a policy to change and introduce proxy votes. I would just urge that there should be some urgency to this reform of the House.
Well, let me respond to the Right Honourable and Learned Lady and to the Honourable Lady. In the first instance, I think it worthwhile to be candid in saying that I am advised, and of course I seek advice and must then hear what the advice is, that it is not within the gifts of party authorities, though I would argue they are in a sense House authorities, to facilitate proxy voting for tomorrow. I respect that view, though in all candour I'm not sure that I agree with it, but it is tendered to me in good faith, and I put it out there for the House to know. I believe that it is absolutely essential, not just in terms of the rights of the honourable member, but for the reputation of this House as an institution approaching or starting to take an interest in the modern world, that the honourable member for Hampstead and Kilburn should be facilitated tomorrow to vote. The notion that she should have to be wheeled through a division lobby, I think would be regarded as very large numbers of people as completely uncivilised. That should not have to happen. It has been suggested to me that in a departure from, or at any rate an extension of, the normal nodding through arrangement that exists, which ordinarily applies to somebody who is indisposed but on the parliamentary estate, the honourable lady could be nodded through so that her vote would count, even if she were in fact in a hospital bed at the time. I do not rule out that possibility, and for my part I would be happy on my own shoulders to agree to that. Personally, I think it preferable that the honourable lady should have a proxy vote, but that does seem to me to depend upon cross-party agreement. I have been approached about this matter by the chair of the all-party group on women in the House, the honourable lady, the member for Chelmsford, who wrote to me very recently. And it's good to see the honourable lady, the member for Chelmsford, is in her place. Forgive me, I hadn't seen her, and if she wants to come in on this exchange very properly, she can, not if she doesn't wish to do so. I wrote back to the honourable lady, the member for Chelmsford, making it explicitly clear that I have, from this chair, made clear my own support for and willingness to assist in the introduction of proxy voting for purposes of baby leave. I have done that several times. I think it is important for the House to know, and for those attending our proceedings to be told of the facts of this matter. This matter has been debated in the Chamber twice. First, on the 1st of February last year, in a debate under the auspices of the Backbench Business Committee, if memory serves me, a debate secured at the instigation of the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, the member for Camberwell and Peckham. Now, on that occasion, the proposition that proxy voting for baby leave should be introduced was passed, if I'm right, nem con, that is to say, without opposition. Subsequently, there was a debate in this chamber on the 13th of September last year, in government time, what is called a general debate. There was no division of the House, and so there is no recorded vote, but my recollection on that occasion is that there was strong support for the change. The Leader of the House, who I think was present at the time, indicated her desire to expedite progress on this matter, and I understand from my own contacts it to have been very much her wish to be able to bring about change before the end of last year. I think, if I may say so, and I will, it is extremely regrettable that almost a year after the first debate, and over 4 months after the second debate, this change has not been made. This is frankly lamentable. Lamentable. Lamentable and very disadvantageous and injurious to the reputation of this House. So if there is agreement that can be reached between the usual channels today, and I'm chairing in the chamber, so members will need to come and tell me what has been agreed, I myself am very happy to facilitate a change for tomorrow, preferably in the form of a proxy vote for the Honourable Lady, but at the very least ensuring that she can be nodded through. It really is time, in pursuit of the express will of this House, that reactionary forces are overcome. And if people want to express their opposition, let them not do it murkily behind the scenes. Let them have the character to say up front that they oppose progressive change. And I hope that we can get progressive change, and what better opportunity to do so than before our historic vote tomorrow. I hope I have made my own views clear. Well, that partly deals with that, and I'm now in the hands of, well, if I may say so, I say for the benefit of our observers, a very formidable band of colleagues. They will help make it happen. Point of order, Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Literally just follows on to that. I would, while I utterly support the idea of proxy voting for women such as our colleague, we have people who are absent from the Chamber and the Parliament for a varying range of illnesses, or partners, family members who are terminally ill. This is actually something that needs dealt with across the range.
That may very well be so, and I'm not unsympathetic to the Honourable Lady's proposition, but I was speaking pretty much off the top of my head, and what I didn't say, but should have said, because it's part of the pattern and the picture, is that the Procedure Committee was invited to consider this matter. I gave evidence to it, as I know other members did, and the Procedure Committee specifically endorsed the idea and was looking for a resolution to be put to the House. Ordinarily, such a resolution would be put to the House by the Leader of the House. I very much regret that that has not happened, but pragmatically, I am seeking, on the back of discussions with the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, to broker progress, not next month or next year or at some unspecified point in the distant future, but with effect from tomorrow. That wider issue of other categories can and should, of course, properly be considered by the House of Commons. Order. We come now to the urgent question. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 6th of January, it was reported in The Observer that the government had...
The Honourable Lady is always ahead of herself. Now, what she does at this stage is just say to ask the Minister for a statement on. We'll get her full blast in a moment. Margaret Greenwood.
Speaker, will she make a statement on universal credit?
Thank you. Minister Alok Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I outlined in the written statement tabled last Friday in the House, we have decided to replace the current regulations relating to managed migration previously laid before the House with 2 new sets of regulations. These will allow a series of measures relating to universal credit to be put in place. The Government will seek powers in an affirmative set of regulations for a pilot of managed migration, so the Department cannot issue any more migration notices once 10,000 people have been awarded universal credit throughout the process. These regulations will also deliver our commitment to provide transitional protection for those managed migrated to universal credit. Separate regulations will put in place a severe disability premium gateway, allowing recipients of this benefit to continue to claim existing benefits until they are managed migrated onto universal credit. In addition, my statement reported that we are bringing forward the necessary legislation to remove the planned extension of the policy to provide support for a maximum of 2 children in universal credit. This overall policy ensures that parents receiving benefits face the same financial decisions about the size of their family as those supporting themselves solely through work. However, we decided that it would not be right to apply this policy to children born before it came into law on the 6th of April 2017, and so we have cancelled this extension. Mr. Speaker, the benefits freeze up to April 2020 was voted for by Parliament as part of the Welfare Reform and Work Act 2016. As a general point, any changes relating to benefit uprating will be brought before Parliament in the usual way.
Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 6th of January, it was reported in the Observer that the Government had decided to ask for powers from Parliament for a pilot of the managed migration of 10,000 people from legacy benefits to universal credit, rather than for a managed migration as a whole. However, on the 7th of January, at oral questions, and the following day, in response to an urgent questions, ministers failed to provide clarification on the Government's plans. Then on Thursday, the Secretary of State told Sky News she didn't expect the Social Security freeze to be renewed when it came to an end in April 2020. And on Friday, the 11th of January, the Secretary of State made a wide-ranging speech on social security about her intentions in relation to managed migration, private sector rents, childcare costs and the 2-child limit. But she did not make it in this House, nor did she give members the opportunity to ask questions about these really important matters. On the same day, the High Court found in favour of 4 single mothers who had brought a legal challenge against the Government on the grounds that universal credit failed to take into account their fluctuating income when they were paid twice in a month because their payday fell very near the end of the month. So can the Minister tell the House, how does the Government intend to respond to the High Court judgment? Does he think the 2-child limit is fair for the children affected by it? And will the Government not scrap the 2-child limit altogether? Will the Government address the key concern with managed migration that nobody's claim for benefits that they are currently receiving will be ended until they have made a successful new claim for universal credit? Will the Government make sure that the levels set for payments to people in receipt of severe disability premium who have already transferred to universal credit reflect the financial loss that they have suffered? Will the Government take immediate action to ensure no one has to wait 5 weeks to receive their initial payment for universal credit? Why is the benefits freeze not going to be cancelled now rather than waiting until April 2020, as she says she believes that the reasons for it being introduced no longer apply? And finally, will this Government call a halt to the rollout of universal credit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. Could I just say that very many people outside this House, many stakeholders, have welcomed the statements that were made in this House on Friday, and of course what the Secretary of State said in her speech. And I'm sorry she welcomed the positive changes that have been made and are being proposed. She talked about a number of issues, and let me just go through them, Mr. Speaker. She talked about the legal judgment on Friday. As she herself has acknowledged, that judgment came out literally a few days ago. As a department, we will consider it very carefully and then respond. In terms of the 2-child policy, of course, we have made that change, and the regulations were laid on Friday, as she will be aware. But she talks about the overall 2-child policy, and we do believe that the overall policy is fair. Ultimately, those who are receiving support in the welfare system should be facing the same sort of choices that those who support themselves solely through work do. And it's worth pointing out that for a family that supports themselves solely through work, if they decide to have another child, they wouldn't automatically expect their wages to go up. This is about sustainability. She talked about the pilot. We've made it very clear that this will start in July 2019. We're working with a very long range of stakeholders on this. We talked about the severe disability premium. Of course, those regulations have been laid. And she talked about the benefit freeze. Could I just ask her to reflect, Mr. Speaker, the reason that we have had to make various policy choices in the past? And that is because the absolutely awful financial mess left to us by the last Labour government. I'm sorry, she can't get away from that point. And the final thing I would say to her, she talks about, Mr. Speaker, changes to the 5-week period. What I would just say to her is that if she is so keen, and I've said it in this House before, if she's so keen on supporting claimants, and particularly the vulnerable, which we on this side are, why did she not support the £1.5 billion of support that came in Budget 2017 and the £4.5 billion of support announced in the 2018 budget?
Order. On account of the fact that we have a Prime Ministerial statement to follow and then 8 hours of protected time for the debate on the withdrawal agreement, I am looking to conclude these exchanges by 4:15, and I'm sure colleagues will want to factor that into their calculations. Mr. Kenneth Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, can I firstly congratulate my right honourable friend the Minister and his Secretary of State on the progress they're making in eliminating some of the obvious defects that have emerged in this otherwise highly desirable policy. Does he agree with me that the problem is the details were designed by people who were well-intentioned but too paternalistic in their attempts to introduce people to the disciplines and normal way of life of people in work, when they were dealing with people often who were very vulnerable and relying day to day on cash? So when it is affordable, after we've really recovered from the consequences of the financial disaster, will he address the 5-week delay in the first payment, which just caused hardship and I hope has gone by the time that the so-called migration comes to my constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his support for the policies that we have announced. I just say to him that in terms of the 5-week period, we of course have ensured that people can get support from day one if they're required in terms of 100% advances. There's 2 weeks of housing benefit run-on that's available as well. And as part of the package we announced in the budget, there is additional run-on support available that will come in from 2020. But of course he's right. We need to make sure that throughout this process we support the most vulnerable, and that's exactly what the changes that have been announced have been all about.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I would like to say how inappropriate it is that the Secretary of State made this statement on Friday outside the House and hasn't even bothered to come here today, Mr. Speaker, to speak for herself. We in the SNP welcome this U-turn from the Secretary of State, which vindicates what we, along with a range of charities, women's organisations and faith groups, have been saying since the July budget in 2015. However, none of us will be fully satisfied while the two-child limit applies for births after the 6th of April 2017. It must be scrapped now. The Secretary of State has accepted already that the fundamental unfairness of the two-child limit. So why does he feel this policy, with its cruel and pernicious rate clause, with this form, Mr. Speaker, must continue even though it has been ruled unfair for other people? Does he not see that this creates a two-tier system in universal credit depending on when children were born? Mr. Speaker, we cannot plan for everything in our life. Has he heard the evidence from Turn to Us and CPAG that the two-child policy is forcing women into terminating healthy pregnancies? Has he heard of the discrimination from religious and ethnic minorities? Does he know that most people claiming this benefit are actually in work? In its first year of operation, it affected 73,530 people. So where does the figure of 15,000 come from, Mr. Speaker? Friday's court ruling laid bare the flaws in universal credit, which many in this House have been highlighting around the payment and the timings of payments. High Court judges said that the DWP had wrongly interpreted the relevant regulations and tried to justify this shamefully on the grounds of cost. What steps will he take to put this right? And will he stop wasting money in the courts rather than ensuring our constituents get what they are fully entitled to? And lastly, Mr. Speaker, in its final year alone, the benefit freeze will cut £4.7 billion from the welfare budget, more than the money that the Chancellor pledged for the work allowance for the next 4 years. Will he make the case to the Chancellor to scrap the freeze, which is making life so hard for so many of our constituents?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that the Honourable Lady has welcomed the changes that have been announced. For that I am indeed grateful. She refers to the Secretary of State. she will be aware that the statement in terms of the changes was made in my name. The regulations have been laid in my name, and that is absolutely appropriate that I come here and quite rightly answer questions that colleagues have. She talked about the non-consensual conception clause, and of course I absolutely agree with her that women who find themselves in these utterly awful circumstances need to get the help that they need, and this has to be done in the most compassionate way. And we have had a discussion on this point previously. What I would say to her, she's aware it is purely a question of whether the circumstances that are described are consistent with someone who has met the criteria for this exception. And it is, of course, the individuals that are dealing with this are third-party professionals who already have experience in supporting vulnerable women. And the final point, in terms of the court judgment on Friday, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, we will consider that and respond.
John Redwood.
I welcome the emphasis on helping people into work and the idea that we should have compassionate implementation. With that in mind, are there going to be changes on earlier timing of benefit for those first in need of it? And is there going to be some review of the housing element, which has sometimes also caused trouble?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. Of course, he's right. Throughout this process, we have to provide support, particularly for the vulnerable. And as he will know, once universal credit is fully rolled out, there will be over an extra £2 billion in the welfare system than under the current legacy benefits. But of course, we have to help the vulnerable. And one of the changes that was made in the budget was the uplifting of work allowances, which will be helping young parents with children, and of course, also the disabled.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any improvements of this hideous programme are welcome, but there are still going to be thousands of UC claimants that are moved on to universal credit this year as a result of natural migration with no transitional protections. So how many people will be pushed into poverty as a result of this move and of the lack of compassion by this government in unfreezing the benefit system?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously in this House, and I said it earlier this afternoon, is that we have put more money into the system to support the most vulnerable. And that's absolutely right, and that is why we have done it. And as far as the pilot phase is concerned, of course, we will work very carefully with stakeholders to make sure we get this right.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
May I warmly welcome this excellent move by his department. And would he please pay tribute to the sympathetic, careful, diligent and effective manner in which the staff of the Job Centre Plus in Haywards Heath carry out their difficult duties?
My right honourable friend highlights a really important point, and he talks about the incredibly hard-working DWP staff in Haywards Heath Job Centre. But of course, I see this, the Secretary sees this, as we go up and down the country talking to our colleagues in job centres. They are all incredibly committed, and they do see the benefits of universal credit in helping people and making sure they provide that one-to-one support to claimants, which wasn't in place previously.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also welcome these modest steps in the right direction, but why did the Secretary of State and the Minister both deny a week ago the change which he's now announced about the separate regulations for the 10,000 migration? Will he respond to the point made by the Father of the House? The 5-week delay is indefensible. It is forcing people to rely on advances, putting them into debt right at the start of their claim.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know we've had this exchange before, and I'm sorry if he feels that I repeat myself, but of course it's important that we get money in people's pocket early. There's no question about that, and that is why we made the changes when we said that we would make sure that absolutely anyone who needed it could get up to 100% of their advances up front. I've talked about the 2-week run-on of those on housing benefit, which doesn't have to be repaid. And as he knows, also in the budget that's just been, we've also announced that from July 2020, those on out-of-work DWP benefits will also get a 2-week run-on.
of the Job Centre Plus in Redditch said this is the best system she's seen in 30 years. She's been at the front line, Mr. Speaker. And does the Minister agree with me that today the Resolution Foundation have pointed out to the fact that it's those people at the lowest end of the income spectrum who are actually getting back into work? This is a truly progressive benefit, and it's great to see these reforms.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend highlights a very important point. I, in fact, was at the launch of the Resolution Foundation's report this morning, which highlighted precisely the point she's raised. And I would just say that I would encourage all colleagues, obviously on the government side, but also on the opposition side, to actually go to their job centres, visit and talk. No, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, if they would talk directly to the people responsible for providing that advice, I think they would find that the system is working.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister should not patronise the opposition by pretending that somehow we don't all do our constituency duty and we haven't been to visit our local job centres. I can assure him we have, and the problem with this benefit were made, he's put a little bit back, which has got to be welcome, but he's not put back what was taken away. And what was taken away is leaving my constituents relying on food bank with not enough to eat. And he needs to recognise that reality.
Mr. Speaker, could I suggest that perhaps this week, if she has time, she and I talk directly with the colleagues in the job centre in her area, and let's have a discussion with them. Let's have a discussion with them and see how we can support her constituents even better.
Hugh Merriman.
Mr. Speaker, surely everybody in this place will want to help people on benefits, but ultimately transfer them so they have the opportunity to work and then pay more into the essential public services that they, and indeed we all, need to get by. Given we have record numbers of employment, record unemployment, surely this policy must be doing something right to those ends.
Mr. Speaker, the policies we've been put in place since 2010 are working. You can see that in the jobs figures. And I would just point out that when we came into power in 2010, 1.4 million people in the country had been on out-of-work benefits for at least 9 of the previous 10 years. That is not a legacy that the opposition should be proud of.
George.
Thank you very much. And yes, universal credit does help Job Centre Plus workers who are trying to persuade people to go into short-hour jobs and zero-hour contracts where their hours of work fluctuate. We welcome very small changes to this which will help a few thousand people. What will the government be doing to help the thousands on universal credit who were paid a few days early over the Christmas period and then received absolutely nothing for their December-January payment of universal credit and are now suffering arrears of rent and childcare payments because of that which the High Court have just ruled against?
Mr. Speaker, we will of course respond on the High Court ruling. 2010, of all the jobs that are being created, 75% are full-time, they are in high-level occupations, and they're permanent. That is something that I wish colleagues opposite would acknowledge.
Nigel Mills.
And the Minister on these announcements, especially the one on the two-child limit, where he appears to have accepted the recommendations of the Select Committee within hours of it actually making them. So perhaps on that theme, he may have missed some previous recommendations if he's looking for ideas. One of those is that for the managed migration he's now trialling, will he look at actually moving people on existing benefits over rather than asking them to make their own new claim? That would seem to me to be a far more effective system and far better for those claimants.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that he feels we're able to react in a matter of hours to the recommendations of the Select Committee. What I think he's talking about is a process of actually sort of pre-population. What I would say to him is that we will, of course, work throughout the pilot phase, and we've responded to the Social Security Advisory Committee with some of the plans that we have. But I would just point out to him that when we had the move to ESA, as a result of having incomplete information, we underpaid people.
Neil Coyle.
I welcome the Minister's commitment to reopening the Wallasey Job Centre in order to meet the commitment he's just made, my honourable friend. But it's 5 years since the government began to impose universal credit. Doesn't this latest change underline it's failed its three aims? It's overdue, over budget and overly complex. And shouldn't all rollout be halted until all the fundamental flaws are fixed?
Mr. Speaker, universal credit has rolled out across the country now, as you will be aware, and we, of course, will continue to proceed with it. He's right. We need to get this right for everyone, and that is precisely what the changes are about. But universal credit does work for the vast majority of people who claim it, but it's absolutely right that we provide that support particularly for the most vulnerable.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
Confirm that when fully rolled out, spending on universal credit will be some £2 billion a year more than on the existing legacy benefits, and this could be worth on average up to £300 per universal credit family.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. There will be more money in the system. And I should point out that under the legacy benefit system, there is £2.4 billion of unclaimed benefits. That will change under universal credit, supporting an estimated 700,000 households who will get paid their full entitlement under universal credit.
Chris Stevens.
Of course, many opposition members take representations from trade unions, the voice of the DWP workforce, which often falls on deaf ears on the government's side. But isn't the reality that the final year of the benefit freeze undermines absolutely any changes ministers are trying to make to the benefit system? So can he tell us what representations he and his department are making to the Treasury to scrap the final year of the benefit freeze? Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, the reason, and I'm not going to apologise for repeating this, the reason that we made so many difficult decisions when we first came into office and in the subsequent years is because of the record deficit we were left by the opposition, and there is no getting away from it. I've already made it clear, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to issues around uprating, these will be announced in the appropriate way to Parliament.
Mr. Campbell, it's very early in the week. I can't put it down to the effects of hot curry because I doubt you've consumed that thus far. But there are several days to go and you need to remain calm. You're a very great figure in the House, but I'm concerned for your well-being. Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been warning ministers about this problem of the dates for months. So will he now rule out... What's the word?
Bring it in?
No. Appealing the court decision.
Mr. Speaker, let me just repeat once more that judgment that she refers to came out on Friday. We are going to have to consider it very carefully, and we will respond in due course.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I applaud the government for listening and for making essential changes based on evidence brought by both sides of the Chamber of the House of Commons? Can the Minister assure me that if further evidence comes to light requiring further changes, that the government will continue to listen and make changes as necessary?
Mr. Speaker, I hope what we have shown over the past couple of years is that we do listen and we do make changes, and of course, where it's appropriate, we will continue to do so.
Mr. Speaker, sometimes it can be hard to understand what the Minister is really saying to us, because most people call non-consensual conception rape, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're talking about. And most people in this country would think picking and choosing between the children we choose to support, most people would call that discrimination, Mr. Speaker. So can I ask the Minister, the next time he has to come to this House, as he undoubtedly will, to tell us about a policy change in relation to the two-child policy, will he commit to telling us exactly what the characteristics are of the kids that our government will no longer support?
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, that the Honourable Lady has not felt able to welcome the changes that we've made. And we have, through the last two budgets, announced additional support. As I've just answered a question to my honourable friend, of course, where appropriate, we will see what more we can do.
Universal credit was rolled out in Thirsk and Malton almost 2 years ago, largely successfully, but there are issues with it, particularly with regard to payment frequency. would my honourable friend commit to continue to listen and to learn and to make adaptations where necessary?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point, because a number of the other issues that were announced by the Secretary of State relate, of course, to looking at more frequent direct payments to private landlords, and also looking at having alternative payment arrangements and proactively offering these.
Owen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do welcome the fact that the Minister is going to disapply this policy for 15,000 children and families, but could he confirm that it is still prospectively going to take more than £2,500 away from 640,000 families in this country? And could he tell me what is fair or compassionate about that?
Mr. Speaker, in terms of this policy, he's right, it'll affect 15,000, support 15,000 families, but we anticipate that over a 5-year period there'll be 77,000 families and 113,000 children who will benefit from this, and it's important that we provide this support. But ultimately, as he will know, that this policy was also tested, the overall policy was tested in the courts and was found to be sound.
Joanna Cherry.
Universal credit is now being rolled out in my constituency and across the city of Edinburgh, and I've been meeting with those who specialise in advising my constituents about problems they encounter in the benefit system, such as the Community Help and Advice Association. They want to know why the government is not addressing all the flaws and halting the rollout until all the serious flaws are properly addressed.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady will find that Universal Credit has already rolled out in her local area. The last rollouts were in December. What I would just say to her, that in terms of providing support, she will be aware of the partnership we now have with Citizens Advice, which will make a difference to help particularly the most vulnerable.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, Minister, I welcome the changes that you have put forward, but however, universal credit has been brought into my constituency, and Minister, it has created incredible problems, delays, reduction of payments. So could the Minister outline what will be done to assist those who are already in the universal credit bubble and system and not in the pilot scheme?
Mr. Speaker, he and I have had a discussion around universal credit previously, and as I've always said to him, my door is open. If he has specific cases, we're very happy to review those.
Roshanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 100 MPs supported the campaign to scrap the two-child limit policy, which is a campaign supported across parties, including by the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central. Some 3 million children will still be affected by the policy, even though the government has decided to relax it somewhat. Can I ask the Minister to heed that advice from MPs and scrap the policy altogether?
Mr. Speaker, we have listened, and as she will know, that I came and spoke to her and other colleagues about this policy in November. We have made the change in terms of retrospective nature, but I would just point out that this overall policy is about fairness, both to those who receive welfare benefits, but also, of course, to taxpayers.
Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This government has finally recognised the risks to women and children of giving universal credit to just one member of a household. So will the Minister now explain how DWP will identify the main caregiver in a household and what other steps will be taken to protect women and children from domestic abuse?
Mr. Speaker, I would just point out that payments to a single person in a household is not a unique feature in universal credit. It also exists in the legacy benefit system. But she's right. Right now, 60% of all universal credit payments go to the female's bank account. And what the Secretary of State has announced is that we will look to see what more we can do to enable the main carer to receive universal credit. Very often that will be the female in the household.
Anna Johnson.
Speaker, we've only been back 7 days, and this is now the second urgent question on universal credit. So isn't it now time for the Secretary of State to come to this House and make a government statement about what she intends to do about the mess of universal credit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry the honourable lady is so unhappy. I would have thought she should be welcoming all the positive changes that we've been making. And indeed, the Secretary of State was before the House just last week in DWP orals answering questions on universal credit and other policy.
We're not your cheerleaders, pal.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Mr. Speaker, when is the government going to do something about this long-winded, cumbersome and complicated process of applying for universal credit? I have a constituent who applied in September and has only received one payment, and we're now in mid-January, mainly because of mistakes made by officials in the department. When is the government going to do something about this?
That's right, Mark. Here.
Mr. Speaker, if he has a specific case, I'd be very happy to look at it. I would just point out that actually payment periods have been, payment timeliness has been increasing under universal credit, but one of the reasons that we may not be able to make full payments to people is because we're waiting to verify some of their costs, which may relate to childcare or rental or whatever. But in terms of the case he's raised, very happy to talk to him about it.
Sammy Wilson.
I know from private conversations with the Minister that he genuinely does want this system to work, and I welcome the changes that he has made. Could I suggest to him that when it comes to the migration of existing legacy benefits, that instead of requesting the applicant to provide the information, the department uses the information it already has available and works out what is available to, or what payments should be made payable to the person?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind words, and of course again he's raised the issue of pre-population. We've set out to, in our response to the Social Security Advisory Committee, what we plan to do, but the key thing is we need to make sure we get all the information so we can pay people the full amount that they're due.
Ellen Jones.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Last year, several newspapers carried harrowing accounts of women forced to seek abortions simply because of the two-child limit policy. I hear what the Minister has said about retrospective changes, but how will what is being proposed help women who have unplanned pregnancies and wish to go ahead with their pregnancy do so?
Mr. Speaker, as she will know, we have a set of exemptions in the policy already. We announced recently 2 further exemptions, but what I would just say to her, that in terms of the overall policy, this was tested in the courts last year and was found to be sound.
Then Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, will the British government extend much-needed transitional protection to people who are migrating naturally to a change of circumstance?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the best way that he can make sure that we provide support in terms of transitional protection for those who migrate across is actually to support the affirmative regulations when we have a vote on them.
Mike Kane. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 bishops wrote to the government condemning the two-child limit last year. Does the Minister counsel those bishops to advise their flocks considering having a third child to exercise more social responsibility?
Mr. Speaker, when I met parliamentary colleagues recently to discuss the two-child policy, that particular meeting was chaired by the Bishop of Durham, and we have made changes to the policy. But I would say that overall, what this policy is about is being fair to the taxpayer and being sustainable at the same time.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Some EU citizens are now being refused universal credit as they can't produce proof of residency rights. This is particularly affecting women in a caring role who have worked less and paid less tax. I welcome the Secretary of State's wish to reduce the impact of universal credit on women. So can his department review this scandal before it becomes a new shame on universal credit?
Mr. Speaker, there's a clear set of criteria which determine whether someone can claim universal credit, but where she has, well, what I would just say to her is where she has a specific case or specific sets of cases, she should come and discuss those with me.
Ooh, what a taxing choice. Mr. Alan Brown.
Hey. A good choice, Mr. Speaker. Follow the question from Wemmer for Central Ayrshire. Has he assessed how many EU citizens that have made their lives here are now routinely being turned down for universal credit? People like my constituent Laura Nani, who until we got a decision overturned last week would have been evicted for rent arrears and left homeless and penniless. When will they look into this, and will they apologise to my constituent for DWP getting it wrong? And I know the Prime Minister sitting next to him. I raised this matter at Prime Minister's questions, and she dismissed it out of hand.
Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear. Where we get something wrong in the department, we apologise, and I write and apologise to individuals and colleagues. But where we have specific cases to raise, again, I'd be very happy to meet with him and his colleague.
Drew Hendry.
Saving the best for last, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for nearly 6 years, from pilot through to full service rollout, my constituents in Inverness and then the rest of my constituency have been suffering and reporting to this government on the flaws of universal credit. Now that these mistakes have been admitted to and the flaws have been acknowledged, what is he going to do to compensate those people who have endured that suffering?
Yeah, you say correct.
Mr. Speaker, I would just say that overall the universal credit policy is absolutely working. It is getting more people into work, and that ultimately is what the welfare system is also about. And I would just say to him is that where he has individual cases, as he himself knows, I'm very happy to take those up and discuss them with him.
Thank you. Order. Statement, the Prime Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the further assurances and clarifications we have received from the European Union on the Northern Ireland Protocol. As a proud unionist, I share the concerns of members who want to ensure that in leaving the European Union we do not undermine the strength of our own union in the UK. That is why, when the EU tried to insist on a protocol that would carve out Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK's customs territory, I said no. And I secured instead a UK-wide temporary customs arrangement, avoiding both a hard border on the island of Ireland and a customs border down the Irish Sea. I also negotiated substantial commitments in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration to do everything possible to prevent the backstop ever being needed, and to ensure that if it were, it would be a temporary arrangement. But listening to the debate before Christmas, it was clear that we needed to go further. So I returned to Brussels to faithfully and firmly reflect the concerns of this House. The conclusions of December's Council went further in addressing our concerns. They included reaffirming the EU's determination to work speedily to establish by the 31st of December 2020 alternative arrangements so that the backstop will not need to be triggered. They underlined that if the backstop were nevertheless to be triggered, it would indeed apply temporarily. They committed that in such an event, the EU would use their best endeavours to continue to negotiate and conclude as soon as possible a subsequent agreement that would replace the backstop. And they gave a new assurance that negotiations on the future relationship could start immediately after the UK's withdrawal. Since the Council and throughout the Christmas and New Year period, I've spoken to a number of European leaders, and there have been further discussions with the EU to seek further assurances alongside the Council conclusions. And today I have published the outcome of these further discussions with an exchange of letters between the UK Government and the Presidents of the European Commission and European Council. The letter from President Tusk confirms what I said in the House before Christmas, namely that the assurances in the European Council conclusions have legal standing in the EU. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Attorney-General, has also written to me today, confirming that in the light of the joint response from the Presidents of the European Council and the Commission, these conclusions, quote, would have legal force in international law. And setting out his opinion, reinforced by today's letter, that the balance of risks favours the conclusion that it is unlikely that the EU will wish to rely on the implementation of the backstop provisions, and further that it is therefore his judgment that the current draft withdrawal agreement now represents the only politically practicable and available means of securing our exit from the European Union. Mr. Speaker, I know that some members would ideally like a unilateral exit mechanism or a hard time limit to the backstop. I've explained this to the EU and tested these points in negotiations, but the EU would not agree to this because they fear that such a provision could allow the UK to leave the backstop at any time without any other arrangements in place and require a hard border to be erected between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I have been very clear with them that this is not something we would ever countenance, that the UK is steadfast in its commitment to the Belfast Agreement and would never allow a return to a hard border. But it is not enough simply to say this. Both sides also need to take steps to avoid a hard border when the UK is outside of the EU. Failing to do so would place businesses on the island of Ireland in an impossible position, having to choose between costly new checks and procedures that would disrupt their supply chains or breaking the law. So we have the backstop as a last resort. But both the Taoiseach and I have said consistently that the best way to avoid a hard border is through the future relationship. That is the sustainable solution, and that neither of us want to use the backstop. So since the Council, we've been looking at commitments that would ensure we get our future relationship or alternative arrangements in place by the end of the implementation period, so that there will be no need to enter the backstop and no need for any fear that there will be a hard border. And that is why, in the first of the further assurances they've provided today, the EU has committed to begin exploratory talks on the detailed legal provisions of the future relationship as soon as this Parliament has approved the deal and the withdrawal agreement has been signed, and they have been explicit that this can happen immediately after this House votes through the agreement. If this House approved the deal tomorrow, it would give us almost 2 years to complete the next phase of the negotiations. And of course, we will have the option to extend the implementation period if further time were needed for either 1 or 2 years. It is my absolute conviction that we can turn the political declaration into legal text in that time, avoiding the need for the backstop altogether. The letters also make clear that these talks should give particular urgency to discussion of ideas, including the use of all available facilitative arrangements and technologies for replacing the backstop with permanent arrangements, and further, that those arrangements are not required to replicate the backstop provisions in any respect. So, contrary to the fears of some honourable members, the EU will not simply insist that the backstop is the only way to avoid a hard border. They have agreed to discuss technological solutions and any alternative means of delivering on this objective, and to get on with this as a priority in the next phase of negotiations. Second, the EU has now committed to a fast-track process to bring our future trade deal into force once it has been agreed. If there is any delay in ratification, the Commission has now said they will recommend provisionally applying the relevant parts of the agreement so that we would not need to enter the backstop. Such a provisional application process saved 4 years on the EU-Korea deal, and it would prevent any delays in ratification by other EU member state parliaments from delaying our deal coming into force. Third, the EU has provided absolute clarity on the explicit linkage between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and made that link clear in the way the documents are presented. I know some colleagues are worried about an imbalance between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, because the EU cannot reach a legal agreement with us on the future relationship until we are a third country. But the link between them means the commitments of one cannot be banked without the commitments of the other, and the EU have been clear they come as a package. Bad faith by either side in negotiating the legal instruments that will deliver the future relationship laid out in the political declaration would be a breach of their legal obligations under the withdrawal agreement. Fourth, the exchange of letters confirms that the UK can unilaterally deliver all of the commitments we made last week to safeguard the interests of the people and businesses of Northern Ireland and their position in our precious union. For it gives clear answers to address some questions that have been raised since the deal was reached. That the deal means no change to the arrangements which underpin North-South cooperation in the Belfast Agreement. That Stormont will have a lock on any new laws the EU proposes should be added to the backstop, and that the UK can give a restored Northern Ireland executive a seat at the table on the joint committee overseeing the deal. Mr. Speaker, President Juncker says explicitly in his letter that the backstop would represent a suboptimal trading relationship for both sides. We've spoken at length about why we want to avoid the backstop, but it is not in the EU's interests either. For this backstop gives the UK tariff-free access to the EU's market. It does so with no free movement of people, no financial contribution, no requirement to follow most of the level playing field rules, and no need to allow EU boats any access to our waters for fishing. Furthermore, under these arrangements, UK authorities in Northern Ireland would clear goods for release into the EU single market with no further checks or controls. This is unprecedented and means the EU relying on the UK for the functioning of its own market. So the EU will not want this backstop to come into force, and the exchange of letters today makes clear that if it did, they would do all they could to bring it to an end as quickly as possible. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, I fully understand that these new assurances still will not go as far as some would like. I recognise that some members wanted to see changes to the withdrawal agreement, a unilateral exit mechanism from the backstop, an end date, or rejecting the backstop altogether. Although it should be said that this would have risked other EU member states attempting to row back on the significant wins we had already achieved, such as on control over our waters or the sovereignty of Gibraltar. But the simple truth is this: the EU was not prepared to agree to this, and rejecting the backstop altogether means no deal. Whatever version of the future relationship you might want to see, from Norway to Canada to any number of variations, all of them require a withdrawal agreement, and any withdrawal agreement will contain the backstop. And that is not going to change, however the House votes tomorrow. And to those who think we should reject this deal in favour of no deal because we cannot get every assurance we want, I ask, what would a no-deal Brexit do to strengthen the hand of those campaigning for Scottish independence, or indeed those demanding a border poll in Northern Ireland? Surely this is the real threat to our union. Mr. Speaker, with just 74 days until the 29th of March, the consequences of voting against this deal tomorrow are becoming ever clearer. With no deal, we would have no implementation period, no security partnership, no guarantees for UK citizens overseas, and no certainty for businesses and workers like those I met in Stoke this morning. And we would see changes to everyday life in Northern Ireland that would put the future of our union at risk. And if, rather than leaving with no deal, this House blocked Brexit, that would be a subversion of our democracy, saying to the people we were elected to serve that we were unwilling to do what they had instructed. So I say to members on all sides of this House, whatever you may have previously concluded, over these next 24 hours, give this deal a second look. No, it is not perfect, and yes, it is a compromise. But when the history books are written, people will look at the decision. People will look at the decision of this House tomorrow and ask, did we deliver on the country's vote to leave the European Union? Did we safeguard our economy, our security and our union? Or did we let the British people down? I say we should deliver for the British people and get on with building a brighter future for our country by backing this deal tomorrow, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. In December, the government shamefully pulled the meaningful vote on her deal, with a promise that the Prime Minister would secure legal assurances from the EU that the backstop would be temporary. The Leader of the House confirmed this, saying the Prime Minister is determined to get the legal reassurances that members want to see. While the Foreign Secretary told us the Prime Minister would find a way to win tomorrow's common vote by getting assurances with legal force that the Irish border backstop is only temporary. On receiving this letter today, to the Prime Minister from the President of the EU Commission and the Council, it must now be clear to all members across this House, yet again, the Prime Minister has completely and utterly failed to do that. Today's letter is nothing more than a repetition of exactly the same position that was pulled more than 1 month ago. It categorically does not give the legal assurances this House was promised and contains nothing but warm words and aspirations. Mr. Speaker, Isn't it the case that absolutely nothing has changed from the Attorney-General's letter of advice to the Cabinet? His advice, which the government tried to hide, explained with great clarity the reasons why the UK could find itself locked into the Northern Ireland backstop protocol with no legal escape route. Today's letter means nothing. The truth remains that by the end of 2020, the UK will face a choice of either extending the transition period, which comes at an unknown financial cost, or we will fall into the backstop, which the Attorney-General has said endures indefinitely until such time as an agreement supersedes it. He has himself updated his legal advice today, as the Prime Minister just said, and he clearly says, and I quote, "They do not alter the fundamental meanings as he advised them in November." If there were legally binding assurances on the temporary nature of the backstop, then surely they would have been written into the withdrawal agreement itself. The letter published this morning is clear that this is not possible, saying we're not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, this morning's joint letter does say negotiations can start as soon as possible after the withdrawal from the UK. But my question to the Prime Minister is, how is that possible when the Cabinet cannot agree it amongst themselves? That is why the political declaration is so vague. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I believe the right word is nebulous. Given the Prime Minister has failed to secure the promised changes, there can be no question of once again ducking accountability and avoiding tomorrow's vote. No more playing for time, no more running down the clock to scare people into backing this damaging shambles of a deal. I'm sure members across the House will not be fooled by what has been produced today. It's clear what we are voting on this week is exactly the same deal we should have voted on in December. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows this. That is why today she's trying to blame others for this chaos. Given the lack of support for the Prime Minister's deal, you might have thought she would try to reach out to MPs. Instead, the Prime Minister is claiming that by failing to support her botched deal, members are threatening to undermine the faith of the British people in our democracy. Mr. Speaker, the only people who are undermining faith in our democracy is the government itself. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no greater example of democracy in action than for this House to reject a deal that is clearly bad for this country. During the past 2 years of shambolic negotiations, the Prime Minister has failed to listen. She hasn't once tried to work with Parliament to construct a Brexit deal that this House and the country can support, and now she's left facing a humiliating defeat and is blaming everybody but herself. Mr. Speaker, if this deal is rejected tomorrow, and I hope it is, the blame will lie firmly with the government and firmly at the feet of the Prime Minister. There is a deal that could command support in the House, which would include a new and comprehensive customs union, a strong single market relationship, and a guarantee to keep pace with European Union rights and standards. Instead, the Prime Minister still chooses to take the most reckless path. Mr. Speaker, as we enter the week of the meaningful vote, we should remember the meaningful vote only happened because of pressure from the opposition in this House. Let us remember the incompetence we've been forced to endure. We've seen 2 years of shambolic negotiations, red lines announced, then cast aside. We're now on our third Brexit secretary, all of whom have been largely excluded from the vital stages of the negotiations. We were promised the easiest trade deal in history, yet we've seen a divided government deliver a botched withdrawal deal with nothing more than a vague outline for what our future relationship with the EU will be. Meanwhile, conditions in this country with millions of people continue to get worse. We just had an urgent question about universal credit and the disaster that is for millions of people in this country. Mr. Speaker, The government is in disarray. It's clear if the Prime Minister's deal is rejected tomorrow, it's time for a general election. It's time for a new government.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that there were many questions to me in the response that the right honourable gentleman gave, but let me respond to some of the points of fact that he referenced, some of which were perhaps not as correct as they might have been. He said, of course, there is no legal termination mechanism in the withdrawal agreement from on the backstop. There is, but the point is that it is not a unilateral termination mechanism. It is a termination mechanism which requires agreement between the two parties. He said that in December 2020 we would face either having the backstop or the implementation period extension. Of course, the point is we are negotiating to ensure that at that point no such choice will be necessary because we will have the future arrangement in place. He says that it's not possible to start the negotiations as soon as the withdrawal agreement, the meaningful vote has been held and agreement has been given to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Indeed, Whitehall stands ready to start those negotiations. We have been looking at what, because we know the basis of those negotiations, it's in the political declaration, and everybody is ready to start those as soon as possible. He talked about at the end about universal credit. Can I just remind the right honourable gentleman that under this government, 3.4 million more jobs have been created. That means all those people able to earn a regular wage to help support their families. And under universal credit, we see a system that is helping people to get into the workplace rather than leaving them living on benefits for nearly a decade, as happened under the last Labour government. And finally, he calls, as he does regularly, for a general election. And here I think we saw yesterday that the right honourable gentleman isn't thinking about the national interest, he is merely playing politics. Because yesterday, when asked whether there was a general election, he would actually campaign to leave the European Union. He refused to answer that question 5 times. We know where we stand. We're leaving the European Union, and this government will deliver it.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Prime Minister on getting rather further than I thought she would with the assurances and the letters that she's obtained. But I fear it will do no good because she's up against two bodies of opinion. One of the hardline Brexiteers on this side and the Leader of the Opposition and his front bench, who think if they call crisis and deadlock, it will result in leaving with no deal. And the others is a lot of hardline Remainers, largely on the backbenches of the Labour Party, who think if they cause chaos and deadlock, it will lead to a second referendum. One of them is wrong. But the problem is she's up against both of them. Does she accept that if we lift our eyes from the present chaos and look to what the country needs, beyond our leaving the EU if the House of Commons insists on doing that, we need a permanently open border in Ireland for treaty and security reasons, and we need a permanently open border for economic reasons across the Channel for our trade and investment? And does she accept that it is difficult to proceed until there's some consensus for that across this House of Commons, and doesn't look as though we're going to get there by March the 29th, which is a date that should obviously be delayed?
All right, thank my right honourable and learned friend for his points and for his question. I don't believe that the date of the 29th of March should be delayed. I think my right honourable and learned friend sets out that there are those who want to see no deal and those who want to see a second referendum and potentially frustrate Brexit. The inexorable logic of that, if this House wants to ensure that we are delivering on Brexit for the British people, is to back the deal that will be before this House tomorrow. tomorrow. And on the issue of the borders and the question of obviously we want to make sure that there is a consistently and sustainably into the long term open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That is our commitment to ensure there is no hard border there. There would be economic advantage in an open border and frictionless trade with between the UK and the European Union. And that's exactly the proposal that the government has put forward.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. That I'm left asking myself, is that it? Is that all you've got, Prime Minister? Because nothing has fundamentally changed. It is a wish list. With little more than 24 hours until this House votes on the Prime Minister's deal, the Prime Minister comes back completely humiliated. The letters published between the UK Government and the European Union reveal that the Prime Minister has utterly failed to get the concessions she promised. The EU letter explicitly insists there cannot be any renegotiation of the backstop or the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, the EU letter states we are not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. The Prime Minister is simply in fantasy land, presenting her statement as bringing changes when they are not. Mr. Speaker, this government must stop threatening no deal. It is time to face reality. Extend Article 50 and let the people decide. And let me say this to the Prime Minister. In Scotland, people know that it is the Tory government dragging Scotland out of the European Union against our will. It is the Tories treating the Scottish Parliament with contempt. And it is this Prime Minister and this Tory party that continues to silence Scotland's voice and sideline our interests. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister this morning said, what if we found ourselves in a situation where Parliament tried to take the UK out of the EU in opposition to a Remain vote? People's faith in the democratic processes and their politicians would suffer catastrophic harm. And yet, she is demanding precisely that in Scotland, taking Scotland out of the EU in opposition to an overwhelming Remain vote. To people in Scotland, the Prime Minister has made it clear that time and time again our voices are not to be listened to. The Prime Minister talks about respecting the results of referendums. The same Prime Minister who voted against Welsh devolution, who voted to wreck the Scottish devolution referendum as well. Mr. Speaker, this is a defining moment. The people of Scotland know more than ever that what comes from a Tory government that we did not vote for. So why does the Prime Minister continue to ignore Scotland's voices and Scotland's interests? Why is the Prime Minister so petrified of allowing the people decide? Now we know the facts. And if she's not, will she now do the right thing? Extend Article 50. Let the people decide.
Minister. I say to the right honourable gentleman that the people across the United Kingdom did decide. They decided in June 2016. They decided that we should leave the European Union, and I believe it is absolutely right that this government is intent on committed to delivering on the vote of the British people. And he talks about the interests of Scotland. Of course, as he knows, the interests of Scotland are best served by ensuring that Scotland remains as part of the United Kingdom. And if the SNP is so clear that a politician should listen to the voice of the people, then the SNP should listen to the voice of the Scottish people expressed in the referendum in 2014 and abandon the idea of independence.
Sir John Redwood.
Given that the EU intends to take huge sums of money and powers off us in return for just 21 or 45 months of more talks and massive uncertainty, why should we ever believe the EU would give us a good deal when they pocket all that they want up front?
Prime Minister.
To my right honourable friend, that throughout the negotiations we have actually ensured that the European Union has had to concede to the United Kingdom government in a whole range of areas on which they did not wish to concede. But if we look into the future, I believe it is, and we do have, my right honourable friend and I do have a difference of opinion in this, in that he believes that WTO terms are right for our future trade with the European Union. I think a more ambitious free trade agreement between us and the European Union is what is right. That's what's set out in the political declaration, and that's what I believe is the good deal for the UK in leaving the EU.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister's confirmed today that under her deal, Britain will remain between 2 and 4 years, possibly longer, in a customs union. The Leader of the Opposition is supporting Brexit with a somewhat longer period in a customs union. With that relatively small difference, aren't they essentially two peas in a pod?
Minister.
No, definitely not.
Sir William Cash.
Will my right honourable friend confirm what she said at Stoke today, namely that she will never extend the date of our leaving beyond the 29th of March this year, and never, in any circumstances whatsoever, allow the repeal of the Withdrawal Act and the European Communities Act 1972 under that Act?
Minister.
To my honourable friend, I did indeed confirm that I believe it is our intent, is what the government is working for, is to leave the European Union on the 29th of March. There are those who may try to find ways to prevent that from happening. I think that is a real risk, but the government is firm in its commitment in relation to leaving the European Union. And in relation to the issue that my honourable friend has raised on the Withdrawal Act, we have passed the Withdrawal Act through this House, through this Parliament. It does repeal the 1972 European Communities Act. Of course, for the period of the implementation period, it would be necessary within the WAB, as my honourable friend knows, to ensure that we are still able to maintain the rules that we need to operate by in order to abide by the negotiated agreement on the implementation period. But I can assure him it remains the commitment of this government to leave the European Union on the 29th of March.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is totally sincere in her sense of duty to this country and in her belief in her deal. But I want to turn her attention to something she doesn't want to contemplate, which is defeat tomorrow night. And I say to her in the strongest terms that the tone and substance she strikes in the wake of that eventuality will define her legacy to this country. And I want to urge her not to succumb to this absurd argument this is a war between this House and the government, when this government is a servant of this House. And I want to urge her also, Mr. Speaker, to, if she loses tomorrow night, give this House an open and honest process where it can express its view, and she and the government then becomes the servant of this House in the negotiations.
Prime Minister.
The government is a servant of the people. We are ensuring that we are delivering what the people want in relation to Brexit. Now, we've negotiated what I believe genuinely is a good deal for the United Kingdom, and that is why I will continue to encourage members of this House to support it.